Howdy. I'm making this video for the benefit of my dear friend Naeema's roommate, Alexander. I hope you're watching this, Alexander. Um, what has triggered the making of this video is a book that you've shared with Naeema, which is, for lack of a better description, a white supremacist piece of literature, piece of fiction that you have shared. And what worries me is that you and perhaps many of your friends out in the US and generally in the West may actually mistake this fiction for reality. So consider this video a gift from your roommate's friend all the way from Pakistan, and let's call it a reality check. All right, so my credentials are that I'm a student of anthropology. Anthropology is not the study of ants, it is the study of human civilization, races, and all of that, right? So, the original human race, modern human, Homo sapiens sapien erectus, we came about 250,000 years ago. And the only place on the planet where we can and we did occur naturally is Africa, on the equator, the equatorial Africa. And the reason is, how we know this is actually two ways. One is because the oldest human remains, and many of these remains that have ever been found have only been found from Africa. And number two is common sense, because your natural habitat is a place where you can occur naturally. You can walk around, be yourself naturally, and it's unnatural to wear clothes. The only place on the planet where you can stay naked, you don't need a fan or a heater. There's no winters, no summers. The temperature variation is not catastrophic for you. The only place where human beings can actually just exist happily in fair weather all year round is on the equator. And the biggest chunk of the equator on land, I mean, most of the equator is on the sea. The biggest chunk of the equator on land is in Africa. So that's how we do know that we're all originally from Africa. And of course, if we're all originally from Africa, we're black. But it's not a preference. It's not we're not black because, oh, it just so happens that people in Africa are black. There is a reason for it. There's a scientific reason for it, which is that black skin is great clothing, it's great sunscreen. All right, so whereas you really need the sun, and back 250,000 years ago, when there were no tailors, there was no concept of cloth or thread or any of that, there was no farming. The only way you could clothe yourself is through nature, which is skin. And whereas the sun is great for you, it gives you vitamin D. 250,000 years ago, there was no other source of vitamin D other than sunlight in any case. But it is also a killer. Sun is packed with UV rays, sunlight is packed with UV rays, and that gives you cancer and death, which is why people in colder areas have do something called spring cleaning at the end of the winters, where they just take out all the bed linen and all the sheets and all the clothes, and they spread them out in the sun, because the sun literally fries the hell. The sun literally microwaves all the bacteria and germs and all these unicellular organisms, ticks, mites, whatever you have it. It'll so the sun will microwave it and kill all these things, right? So 250,000 years ago, we were all black out of necessity. We were black because the sun was constantly beating down on our naked bodies, and we protected ourselves from the UV rays because of our black skin, which is much more resistant to sun damage or UV damage than white skin is. In fact, white skin is the reason why skin cancer is most prevalent in white people is because white skin is actually the worst possible protection you could have against the sun, against the adverse effects of the sun. Okay, so from 250,000 years ago all the way up till only 60,000 years ago, that is to say almost for 200,000 years, people just were happy living in Africa. All right, and equatorial Africa is a paradise. I mean, when you talk about going to vacations, you usually go anywhere on the tropics, and the equator is right in the middle of the tropics. So this belt of the earth is actually the magical paradise of a belt that we have, and that's why most religions tend to think that man, originally Adam and Eve, were in heaven. They were in this paradise where there was plenty of food, plenty of eating, the weather was great. And the historical context of that is because we were in Africa, and Africa literally is, equatorial Africa literally is paradise. All right. So now what happens? 60,000 years ago, the first exodus, human exodus, like a bunch of people, a few tribes got out of Africa and went north and then east. So they entered the Middle East, present day Iran, which is Persia, present day Pakistan, which is where I am, India. And because at that time, at that particular time, the ice age, the last ice age, which is still continuing right now, was at its maximum. It's called the glacial maximus. So you could actually walk down to Australia. The Southeast Asian countries were not islands. You could actually walk down there. So these people, they slowly and gradually made their way all the way to Africa, and that's why we have two Negroid races today: the African Negroid and the Australian Aboriginal Negroids. All right. And then this migration stopped, and it stopped for a very long time. For another 30,000 years, there was no migration out of Africa, and these were the. So now you have two settlements. You have one in Africa, one in Australia, and a fringe settlement all across, from the Middle East to Persia to India to Southeast Asia. And then, but everybody was still black, all right? And then what happens? Then 30, 35,000 years ago, for reasons unknown to us, could be disease, could be just too many people on very few acres of land, the equatorial Africa, so getting small for us perhaps, maybe there was disease. Anyway, something triggered another mass human migration. Not everybody left, the stronger ones stayed, okay? This is the rule of nature. The strong stay their ground, the weaker migrate, and in the process of migration, the weaker, they become stronger, and anyway, we'll talk about that later. So anyway, the next migration that happened, people went in a different direction. People went on the same route as the one before also, and then there was a whole bunch who went further north into present-day Caucasus. Caucasus are these mountain ranges uh, in western Russia, Georgia, southern Georgia, and northern Azerbaijan. So these are the Caucasus. So a bunch of people, black people, settled there, and who then became the forefathers to the Europeans and the Russians and the Central Asians, and also India, present-day Pakistan and India. We call them the Aryans. Okay. Now, why? How did the skin color change? What led to all of this? Right. That's the question. That's the big question. So only 15,000 years ago, the ice ages were the single most important phenomenon to take place to give human beings the variation in features now that we have, including skin color and other features. And that stuff, what happens is people who got trapped in the Caucasus and in Europe, now the ice ages are at a point where there's hardly any sun over there. It's all fogged up, it's foggy, it's all ice and snow on the ground, there's cloud and fog all around. So people are dying of cold. It was literally like hell frozen over. People are dying all over the place. So mutations started taking place, and you started losing black pigmentation, dark pigmentation from your skin, from your epidermis. So what happens when you start losing pigmentation? Epidermis covers your hair and your eyes as well. So you became blonde, blue-eyed. The reason why the nose tapers in is because when you're talking about very cold breaths of air, there's a whole science behind it. You don't want to get pneumonia. You don't want too much ice particles going into your lungs. So the nostrils become smaller. All right. So that's how white people started. How did Chinese people start? So Chinese people, or what is called in anthropology as Mongoloid people, it does not mean that the first such people were from Mongolia. It's just that first such people to kick butt and introduce themselves in Europe were from Mongolia, the Mongols. So these people who were stuck in the steppe of Asia and stuff. So there's ice on the ground, there's no fog, there's no cloud, and there's sunlight coming from the rays. Seriously cold, but it's clear. It's a clear day every day. So now what's happening is the sunlight is hitting your eyes from above, and it's also bouncing off the ice, and it's coming down from below into your eyes as well. And then it's packed with UV, and the most sensitive part of your body to UV is actually the eyes. So I've forgotten, there's a term for this lobe which extended, and they get what you call Chinese eyes, right? And this didn't only happen to humans in that area; it happened to some other animal species as well. All right. So therefore, if you go and take a look at some indigenous fox species, dog species, wolves, and other, even some birds in that part of the world, in China and beyond, you'll see that even they have Chinese eyes, and the reason is evolution and mutation. So now that's how you get your races. Um, there is no other reason behind it. It's basically all mutation to make you more acclimatized to the area where you now inhabit. All right. Now, the second part that I want to address is your delusion that maybe white people are, sons and children of aliens and are superior in some way. Well, that's also, unfortunately for you, not true, because you see the average Eastern Empire, let's say, or dynasties such as the pharaohs of Egypt, have ruled for 4,000 years straight, right? So, like, there's more time gap between the last pharaoh, which is Cleopatra, and her greatest granddaddy, the first pharaoh. There's a much bigger time gap between those two than there is between you and Cleopatra, you and I and Cleopatra. So that's how long just one family ruled the known world at that time. The same is true for so many Chinese empires. The same is true for the Babylonians. The same is true for the Persian Empire. The longest standing Western Empire was the Romans, and the Romans couldn't even make it properly through 1,000 years of rule. All right, the biggest empire that we've known is the British Empire. It didn't even stand properly in its full glory for a whole 100 years. In fact, I'll tell you something. If you really want to get into this very uh, low low life debate of what is the strongest or the most powerful race. Actually, the strongest, most successful race in my books would be the Mongoloid people. Chinese, Japanese, all of these. They outpopulate the rest of all the other races combined. The the biggest military general, the most successful military general that's ever lived is Genghis Khan, who, by the way, in 25 years conquered as much land as the Brits did in 400 years. They have the best food. Everybody goes eats Thai, Japanese, or Chinese all the time. They have great music, great culture. So sorry to burst your bubble on that one as well. Now coming to you, Alexander, you have a great name, Alexander, from Alexander the Great, who, by the way, never thought that he was Westerner. Macedonia at that time was considered the East. He too, and this is why on his conquests he wanted to go east. He was looking for his father, some divine figure, and he decided my father must be from the east. So he connected to the east, not to the west. Number one, we love him. Everybody loves him because, yes, whereas the most prolific general of all time is Genghis Khan, but my favorite general is Alexander, because his main weapon was not his sword or bow and arrow. His main weapon was his heart, the love he had to give. He loved people, and people loved him right back. People he conquered loved him because he was great to them. And how did he do that? So what he did was, whatever area he'd conquer, he'd leave a few hundred generals and soldiers behind to create a new hybrid population. He would marry them in the local population, and he wanted everybody to not be ethnically different. And that explains for your beautiful roommate, Naima. So what you do is you just Google Indo Greeks. Who are the Indo Greeks? And you'll find out. So, like, Alexander lived a longer time here in Pakistan, where I am sitting right now. Then he was never in the U.S., but then he did back home in what you consider Greece, but in Macedonia. So I hope this is an eye opener. I hope you understand that reading the world is a beautiful place. Cultures are gorgeous. Everything is magical. Nature in itself is magic. Reality is beautiful, and it's awe inspiring and it's amazing. So you don't need to come up with stupid, fictitious ideas to make life seem grand. Life is grand. You don't have to read such stupid literature about aliens coming, raping human beings, and accounting for how you were born. That's stupid. But the truth, which is I've just given you a quick summary, is actually much more interesting. So you seem like an intelligent person who's inquisitive, who's curious about where you came from. So I would really recommend that you dig deep into the truth. It'll impress you. Cheers. Bye bye.